So I'm an architect, and I'm professor in architecture and the director of the master program here at the University of Luxembourg. I did a PhD as a young scholar about there was a debate about about how to rebuild Berlin after the fall of the wall. So that was, let's say, the starting point of my, let's say, research activities. And so I was very much married with the topic of, or the territory of Berlin. And after this this work on Berlin in the, let's say, 1990s, a book that I published at Bruder Mann Verlag, which was the publisher of Bruno Taut's publisher, actually. I continued to work on Berlin, but in another, let's say, at another kind of I revisited and re-edited together with Sebastian Marot the Archipelago project, so the city in the city, Berlin, a Green Archipelago. This first manifesto about, as Colas says somewhere in the manifesto, the first work on a zero growth Europe obviously from the 70s because everything has been made in the 70s. And so I that was a long work, 5 years. It took us 5 years to really to finish this work, and then a couple of diverse books also at Lars Müller Publishers. So these positions, it was the beginning of a trilogy. So positions on emancipation, architecture between aesthetics and politics. That was this idea that we don't really basically all those books are made for young people, right?
Yeah.
I would not exclude elderly architects, but this is basically for students and young architects. And I think they are not really aware of the different positions within the discourse on architecture and urbanism. And that was an attempt really to define, it's like today when there is these discussions in Germany, about the coalition, what are the coalitions, in the political discourse, and here the question was, what are the coalitions in the architectural discourse? And especially, is there, again, kind of politicization of architecture possible? Right? So that was the question. As I said, it was the beginning of a trilogy, so the second one was on the question of land.
Which is a very, let's say, timely and also risky field.
Which is indeed, because us as architects, we don't have really competencies in the field of economy. And the question of land really requests this competency, knowledge and economy in... it's interesting because it's super interdisciplinary. And this book was really, I would say, the most challenging book I ever made. Because it's a patchwork of different, you have different contributions from different authors. There's an historic perspective. Then there are interviews with directors of urban development, Amsterdam, Munich, and so on and so forth. And then there is also this idea that I always have in mind. It's a little bit this, a kind of a pool, offering also to students a pool of references, but always looking in a different way on references. For example, you can relook at, Le Corbusier's works, for example. They've been published 1,000 times.
Widely and
But to look at Le Corbusier's work through the lens of the question of land gives a new, point of view on the... And and I'm very interested also in genealogies. So how do you actually define genealogies, historic genealogies?
Exactly.
And always to understand that what we do is in a way inscribed in a certain genealogy.
It's not an isolated action.
Of course.
Okay.
So it's the politics of architecture, and it's about genealogies, basically.
Fantastic.
And then maybe in between there was one big book. It's more kind of a reader that's 700 pages thick, published at Walter König, but I did not write the 700 pages, obviously, that I did with Arno Brandluber, the German architect, and Thomas Mayfried, the graphic designer.
Dangerous and good friends.
Yeah, exactly, totally.
Super.
Yeah, absolutely. If my life was a book, what would be the title?
Yes.
At the search for. So I think I really like this idea that, it's always interesting that basically in science, in research, often people think you have to know what you do. You have to, you have to have an idea, a methodology, and so on. I don't believe in this. And also I think we are facing an inflation of texts. What Roland, I think it was Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault, they had more or less the same point of view, that we are in a kind of a sea, embedded in a sea of text. And the academia is multiplying, let's say, this sea of text. And especially I'm super skeptic towards like these kind of articles. Everything is focused now on articles. And especially, peer-reviewed articles. It has become an economy by itself.
Totally.
And I truly believe, because before, let's say in the 70s, 80s, maybe still in the 90s, you were an interesting researcher when you produced 1, 2, 3 major books. And I'm still in this kind of position.
Okay.
The first book I read was, of course, a gift from my father, who was also an architect. And I perfectly remember this book because it was Giulio Carlo Argan on Walter Gropius. And it's interesting because Gropius was, I have to say that before I didn't read really as a kid books. So I started when I was 16 years old reading. Before I only read comics, right?
Well, it's a kind of literature.
Yeah, that's true. Asterix and so on. But the first real book was Argan on Gropius. And I really remember this book because later on, when I studied, and even, I studied actually, let's say, in the postmodern context, and everybody hated Walter Gropius. He was such a hated person in the history, let's say, in this period of time, because they all made him responsible for a kind of, social ambition of architecture.
Okay.
Because when I studied, it was just about form. There was no politics. There was no economy. There was no social ambition. They always said, my teachers always, most of them, and the big majority always said that architecture cannot make a better world.
That was the...
No, it's just about form finding. The difference between a book and an article, for instance, is that a book needs some time. Of course, you don't read a book. Especially our books. Probably nobody reads our books from A to Z, right?
Exactly.
At the same time, I think it needs time. And I really like this. We talk about, slow food. We talk about slow city. And I think we should also talk about slow literature, And I remember when I started really reading, let's say, books in theory of architecture in the beginning, it was super difficult during my studies, And even if you start reading philosophy or sociology, but let's say the classics, for example, the first time you start reading Walter Benjamin, that's hard stuff.
Yeah.
After 3 or 4 sentences, you say, okay, so what's next? What shall we do? What can we do? Okay, let's return to architecture. But if you really resist to this reflex of comfort in your comfort zone, I think you discover things and you start how do you say, you start into, there's a kind of interweaving of references. You start with the genealogies. Okay, he's mentioning, I don't know, he's mentioning Sherbat. Okay, who was Sherbat? And then you start reading Sherbat and so on. And it's a whole universe that starts, setting up in front of you. And that is the advantage of the slow literature. So therefore, I think books are super important to resist to this acceleration. I think Hartmut Rosa mentioned this, this notion of resonance.
Mm-hmm.
Resonance. I think the book allows you to get into resonance with, with the environment. That's a very interesting question. Is it, if you take it literally? I remember I once went into a flat of a book collectioner. I don't know how you call it. The guy who is collecting books, and he had thousands and thousands of books, obviously very old books. And there was indeed a very weird smell in the, in
the atmosphere.
It was like, so the whole flat was full of books. Every room was a square, and in this square there was a smaller square composed of shelves. So on every wall there was shelves, and then again another square. So everything was composed of corridors of books. The whole flat, 6 squares, thousands and thousands of books, and the smell was very strong. Well, I think, and then of course, it's a very interesting question, because obviously books are something visual, also tactile, because I really like touching books, but you don't really think about the smell at first perspective. But what is, of course, everybody knows, of course, le parfum, the perfume,
Mm-hmm.
and it's always interesting. There's also the history of the smell, obviously, and I think it's interesting that the book, beyond our intellect, and that reminds me something like Ungas, he said that, we need both our intellect and our senses, because the ratio cannot feel, and our feeling cannot be rational. So we need both, obviously, and I think books play this role. They have to be, in a way, I think, appealing, because they're an object, and you could obviously touch them. They have to be beautiful. You have to smell them probably also, but at the same time, the content is always appealing your senses and your spirit.